about exactly how that works, but I want to talk about it today. Whatever you think, whatever you believe about the, should we say, the ontology, the reality or otherwise of these alternate worlds, they are in themselves remarkable. The fact that you can inhale 1 or 2 lungfuls of this simple plant alkaloid and have your world instantaneously obliterated and replaced with this extremely bizarre, higher dimensional, inordinately complex and populated world is in itself a remarkable thing. And that in itself is worthy of study and worthy of exploration. So today, I want to talk about how we become explorers, not just of the normal waking world, but how we can become explorers of perhaps an almost infinite array of different worlds. I will focus on the worlds that you reach under the influence of DMT, but it is my contention, it is my belief that there are many, many other types of worlds that are available for our discovery and exploration. So I'll break the talk into 3 components. First, I will talk about the brain. I am a neuroscientist, so I'm interested in the brain. I reach into some decidedly speculative territory, but I always keep one foot firmly within the neuroscientific arena. So I will then talk about what to me is the central concept, which I have developed and explain in detail in my book, Reality Switch Technologies, which I call the world space, the space of all possible experienceable worlds, all possible worlds that a human being can or could experience. This is the world space. I will talk about its structure and how we might begin to explore it. And then finally, I will talk about the molecular technologies, DMT being one of the most well-known and most efficient and powerful molecular technologies for transferring ourselves, essentially, transferring our subjective experience into what we might call an alternate reality space, and how we might do that on a semi-permanent basis. So we're not talking about just a few minutes or even a few hours. You might go to these places for months. And I think I'm not suggesting anyone actually do this, or that this is something that we should be trying to do, but I think it has interesting philosophical implications as well. The fact that it could be possible, the fact that we might be in one of these machines that I will talk about right this very moment. There's something to think about. So, we've all, well, I'm going to assume we've all seen this movie. Of course, The Matrix. Here is Neo, and he is looking down upon all of these pods within which these humans are suspended, their bodies kept alive in order to produce energy for the machines. I believe that was the plot, yeah, something like that. And all the while, of course, they are experiencing a world internally. This is the Matrix. Now, of course, we all assume that, well, perhaps we don't all assume, but we like to perhaps believe that this isn't us, that we are not this, that we don't actually have what could be a completely different type of body that is being, right now, this very moment, suspended in some sort of medium, and our world being something constructed entirely in the head. Because the world is always constructed entirely in your head. This is a point I make forcefully many times. The world you experience is always this model that's being constructed by your brain. Under all circumstances, whether you're waking, dreaming, under a DMT trip, The world you experience is always the model. You never have direct access to the environment. So that makes your brain, as I said, a world-building machine. Its purpose is to construct this functional and adaptive and useful model of the environment that allows you to navigate and to function, to thrive, to reproduce within that thing, that unknowable, noumenal thing outside of us that we refer to as the environment. So your brain is this world-building machine. And in particular, it's this outer layer of the brain called the neocortex. The neo there, you see, there's another matrix reference. So the neocortex, also called the gray matter, you see this gray matter on the outside of the brain. It's actually a very thin layer. It's just a few millimeters thick. And itself is built from about 6 identified layers. It is this part of the brain, your cortex for short, that is responsible for constructing your world. So I want to talk about how, first of all, how your brain constructs your world. Now, if you were to take a microscope and look at a tiny piece of cortex, what you would see is that it was built from these cylindrical columns, and in fact these are referred to as cortical columns. These cylindrical columns that are stacked together, side by side, a kind of mosaic structure if you look at it from above. And each cortical column is itself constructed from large numbers of these brain cells, neurons, these information-generating cells called neurons. I'll talk more about information in particular tomorrow in the intensive. So this is another visualization. It's maybe a little bit small. You have these cortical columns. Here we have a small section of the cortex. These cortical columns that can be activated. So you can think of these cortical columns as being on or off, active or inactive. You might even think of the entire cortex, if it helps you to imagine this, as like a huge sheet with lots of LED lights upon it. And these lights can flash on and they can flash off. And so they generate a pattern. They generate a pattern of information. So here we see the blue columns, we might say. These are the active columns, the ones that are switched on, that are lit up. And the inactive ones are in grey. So again, another visualization of the columns. So I'll use these little circles to represent these cortical columns throughout this talk. So when you see these, make sure you know what I'm referring to. And from the side, you can see they have a number of layers that are important in the computational processing within these cortical columns. So again, we have this 3D mosaic structure, the cortical columns going into the screen there. And these cortical columns can be active or inactive, so we get patterns of information, patterns of cortical column activity. And these patterns are always changing. In your brain now, these patterns of cortical columns are constantly changing because your subjective world, the informational structure, the content, the dynamics of the world that you experience is this pattern of cortical column activation, experienced from your subjective perspective. And these cortical columns, they are not independent, of course. The brain is a network. It's highly interconnected. So these cortical columns have connections between them. And the connections between the cortical columns allows them to speak to each other, to communicate, for information to flow through them. This unifies this pattern of cortical column activation to create your unified experience of the world. So your entire world at this very moment is this unified pattern of cortical column activation. So let's crystallize this a little bit. Let's imagine some perceived visual objects. This little alien face, not dissimilar to myself. Thank you. So this little alien face, I'm not smart enough to actually have it move. So imagine it's moving. So it's moving to the right. So we can break this face down and say, well, it has a number of qualities, a number of properties. It has, well, there's the shapes here, right? We can see circles. We can see a certain texture to it. It has colors. We have yellow and we have blue. It has movement as well. So these are all different types of information, and they're all represented in different areas of the cortex by different sets of cortical columns. So we might imagine, so this is the visual percept. This is what this alien face appears like to you. But underneath the wiring, if you like, we see a pattern of cortical column activation. We have a pattern of cortical columns that represent motion. We have cortical columns devoted to representing color information. We have cortical columns that represent form, shapes, and things like this, and also texture, etc. This is obviously a huge simplification here. But you get the idea. You have different cortical columns that are representing different features of the world, and it's all unified by the connectivity, the patterns of connectivity between the cortical columns. So this is the cortical representation. Now, your brain, as I said, is always constructing your world in this way, and it does so with great efficiency. Your brain is perfectly happy constructing a clear, a coherent model of reality, even in the absence of any kind of sensory information. When you fall asleep at night and you start dreaming, your brain is constructing the world in basically the same way as it does when you are awake. The world is still the model when you're awake, of course. You're not directly seeing the world. The brain is not a video camera. The brain receives patterns of sensory information, but all it does is use those to help constrain and guide the model construction. So this movement from one pattern of cortical column activation to the next. This movement is guided by sensory information, but it isn't sensory information as such. The information from which your world is constructed is always the model. It's always this pattern of cortical column activation. And your brain has sculpted the connectivity between these columns such that it kind of knows how to construct the model of the environment, which is why it's capable of doing that even without sensory information. And we call this intrinsic activity. So your brain is a natural world builder. Your world kind of falls out of neural activity. Your brain can't help building worlds. So, a little bit of technical information there. So I will just summarize very briefly. Your world model is encoded by the pattern of activation of the columns. This is the basic takeaway message there. Another way of saying this, your world model is a highly complex pattern of information. This will make more sense tomorrow in the intensive. So as I said, sensory information doesn't really even enter the brain. It stimulates neurons that pass information into the brain and then is used to guide the construction of your world model. So one way of looking at this is that sensory information is kind of matched. Your brain is constantly looking for certain patterns of sensory information in the environment that it can match to the information it is generating. So with DMT, and this is kind of a heads up for tomorrow, I won't go into detail about how this works today. DMT seems to be, well, DMT is a completely different world model. It's still a model. It's still a pattern of cortical column activation, but it's a completely different world model. The brain shifts from constructing the normal waking world, shown on the left, to this very strange alternate reality. And the fact that it can do that is a remarkable thing. It's my contention that this would require an alternate information source, an alternate source of sensory information to guide the construction of this model, in the same way that sensory information from our universe, if you like, from our world, from the environment, helps guide the construction of the normal waking world model. But more on that tomorrow. So again, we have this pattern of cortical column activation. So you might ask yourself, we look at this. Now this is obviously, there are many, many, many more columns in an actual human brain. We might ask ourselves, well, if your entire world is represented as a pattern of column activation, how many different patterns of column activation are there? And another way of saying that's basically asking the question, how many different worlds can you possibly experience? And there is a way to calculate this, actually. If you assume that these columns can either be active or inactive, so have only two states, then you have 2 to the power of the number of columns in the brain, which is an extremely large number. Ask your calculator if you don't believe me. It will throw an error. Oh. So we can think, how many possible worlds could you experience? Well, this is simply all possible cortical column activation patterns. Each individual cortical column activation pattern, each state, is your entire world at a single moment in time. So this generates what I call the world space. It is a kind of state space, if you like. All possible worlds, all possible moments, world moments, if you like, are represented within this world space. It is not possible for a human brain to construct a world outside of this world space. So this means that within this world space we will find the normal waking world. We might call this the consensus reality space. This is a set of states, a set of cortical column activation patterns within the world space. It also means, of course, that the DMT worlds are to be found within this world space. And many other worlds as well. A practically infinite number of worlds that the human brain can construct. Worlds that we can experience, worlds that we can discover, worlds that we can explore. So the normal waking world, this set of states within the world space, I refer to as the consensus reality space, a set of states, a region, a district within the larger world space. So your experience of a world, of course, is the movement from one state to the next, one moment to the next, one world to the next. The world you are experiencing now is different to the world that you are experiencing now. You are moving from state to state, from world to world, through this small district. I've massively overestimated the size of the consensus reality space, I think, here. this very small district within the world space is what you are moving through now. And your brain has tuned its connectivity such that it naturally occupies this small region within the world space, which represents this functional and adaptive model of the environment. So to summarize, we have this world space, which is simply all possible states, all possible cortical column activation patterns, which forms this state space, which I call the world space, because each state represents your entire world at any moment in time. And again, crucially, all possible worlds that a human being can experience, that a human brain can construct, can model, are represented within this world space. So we have this world space to explore, endless terrains of the mind. So the consensus reality space, this small district within the world space that represent this adaptive model of the environment. This is our default world, if you like, our default set of worlds. And the cortex tunes this connectivity throughout evolution, development, and experience all the time. Your brain is tuning its connectivity such that it naturally moves towards these states. So these states within the consensus reality space form an attractor basin, which is a frightening word perhaps for some of you, but I'll jump to this for a second. An attractor is simply the state to which, towards which a system will naturally move towards. So if you drop a marble into a glass bowl, it will naturally find its way to the point of lowest energy, which is the base of the bowl. So this acts as the single attractor for this marble in the glass bowl. Now we can look at some very simple net models of cortical columns, if you like neural networks. So this is called a Hopfield network. Again, don't worry too much about the details, but you have a very simplified system with just, let's say, 3 cortical columns that are connected, that influence each other. And what you find, so here's the complete state space of the Hopfield network. So you might think of this as the world space of the Hopfield network here with 3 cortical columns, all possible activation patterns. These are 8 different worlds, if you like. And this Hopfield network will move towards, if you kind of let it run, it will move towards one or more sometimes of these 8 states. So this here, this 5th state, we call this the attractor state. But when we change the strengths of the connections between the columns of this Hopfield network, we can actually change the attractor state. So your brain is constantly altering and tuning its connectivity such that it moves towards the states within the consensus reality space. So your brain, of course, is much more complex, much more complex than any kind of Hopfield network. But it illustrates the point that your brain can control its connectivity in order to move towards the states, the worlds that represent this functional model of the environment. So here again, we have the world space, all possible states, all possible worlds a human can experience, and we have the consensus reality space, which is this small district within the world space. So if we were to plot the energy, how favored, how likely each state was to be reached by the cortex on a kind of plane, it would look something like this. You would have these low energy attractors that are the cortex wants to move towards in the same way that the marble wants to move towards the base of the bowl. These low energy attractors, then you have these high energy states that the brain cannot reach normally. So the DMT worlds are within some high energy region of the world space. We might call this the world space landscape. It's an attractor landscape. So again, just a slightly different perspective. We can see the cortex is moving from state to state, from one pattern of cortical column activation to another, dictated to some extent by the energy of this state. How low energy is it? How favored is the particular state? Again, you might visualize it something like this, moving through the valleys and the basins of this world space landscape, but never reaching these high energy states. These are the states we want to reach, of course. This is where the DMT worlds are. This is where all the other strange worlds we are yet to discover will be found. So we start to build a slightly more complete picture now. We have our consensus reality space. This is where our brain occupies most of the time. But clearly, sometimes the brain is able to reach other areas of this world space. We might call this an alternate reality space. How can we cause the brain? How can we perturb the brain, stimulate the brain, such that it naturally moves towards these alternate regions of the world space, these alternate reality spaces? So again, going back to the idea of the attractor landscape, the consensus reality space sits in this low energy well or basin within the world space. This is where your cortex tends to remain. And these alternate reality spaces, these other worlds, occupy higher energy positions. So can we do this? Can we do this? Can we lower the energy? Can we make the states of these alternate worlds more favorable? Can we convert them into an attractor basin such that the brain will naturally move towards them? Well, it turns out that we can. Shortly ago, I forget when this was published, but maybe just last year, the psychedelic research group at Imperial College London, were actually able to kind of map not the entire world space, but map the kind of energetic landscape, the small part of the energetic landscape, this attractor landscape of the brain. And they found that under the influence of psychedelics, it kind of flattens out. So you no longer have this deep valley, this deep basin, but things start to flatten out, which means that you can start to explore more regions within the world space. So, for example, here we have in the normal waking state, we have this deep basin. This restricts the number of states that the brain can reach. This restricts the number of worlds the brain can experience, because there's a transition energy and there's an energetic hill that the cortex needs to get over to reach these alternate states. But under the influence of psilocybin, the whole thing kind of flattens out. And so the brain can start to reach more regions. This is why your world changes under the influence of a psychedelic. It reaches states that it couldn't normally reach. It expands. It expands this consensus reality space to include more states.
Andrew, it's not creating those states, it's just accessing already existing other states.
Exactly. So it's allowing you to reach out of this narrow district within the consensus reality space and reach out into other states. So your world begins to change. And because the attractor landscape is flattened, your brain can explore states within this world-space landscape much more freely. This is why your world becomes more fluid, it becomes more dynamic, becomes more labile under the influence of a psychedelic, certainly at low doses. And this, again, has been measured with psychedelics. We can look at the patterns, not at the level of individual columns, but different areas of the cortex. We can see the states that they move between over time. And under the influence of a psychedelic, it's been shown that not only does the brain explore more states within a certain period of time, but it also reaches states that it can only reach under the influence of the psychedelic. So it's expanding your brain's state repertoire, is a very intelligent sounding way of putting it. So bearing that all in mind, again, we have the consensus reality space, this low energy region, and then we have the alternate reality space. But flattening the world space landscape isn't really good enough because the cortex then will tend just to kind of wander a little bit more randomly outside of the consensus reality space. What we really want to do, as I said before, is to actually cause a more dramatic restructuring of this world space landscape. And there is a molecule that does this. And that is DMT. So this alternate reality space, as I called it before, well, this is the DMT space. In the presence of DMT, the brain transcends this initial flattening and collapses into an entirely new world model. The attractor landscape, this world space landscape, collapses into an entirely new geometry. So this is DMT. It is more than just a world space flattening agent. It is an agent that allows your brain to naturally reach these completely disjoint, these completely separate areas of the world space landscape. And this is why the DMT world bears no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. This isn't just an expansion out of the consensus reality space. This is shifting to an entirely different region of the world space landscape. Regions where entirely different worlds are constructed and represented. Let's get that. So again, just for those not that familiar with DMT, if you'd heard me speak so far, you certainly will be by now, but DMT is this simple plant alkaloid, and it causes you instantaneously within just a few seconds of inhaling some DMT vapor into these bizarre hyperdimensional worlds filled with alien intelligences. There are very good reasons why we might want to explore these spaces and spend time within these spaces. Far more complex than anything in the normal waking world, hyper-technological, higher dimensional, seven-dimensional objects being created, manufactured by highly intelligent beings, what I consider to be some kind of non-human advanced alien intelligence. And also kind of unusual about DMT compared to the other classic psychedelics, which at high doses tend to cause destruction of the ego, destruction of the self, destruction of that central sense of agency. The DMT state tends to be much more lucid. You maintain your sense of self, you maintain your agency, which is also what makes it rather frightening in some sense, because there's still someone there to be scared. Unlike 5-MeO. And 5-MeO, people say it's before you lose. it's coming back, going there and coming back when you still have your ego that you're most likely to get scared, but then there's no one left to be scared at the peak of the experience. And also another feature that's very interesting with DMT is this sense of familiarity, sense of déjà vu, when you go into this space, which is uncanny. Despite being the strangest, the most bizarre experience you could possibly not imagine, it also is, for some weird reason, extremely familiar. You feel like you've come home. You feel like you've been there before, but you just don't know when.
Is that molecule acting as a serotonin reuptake inhibitor?
No, it's acting as a 5-HT2A agonist. More on that tomorrow. So again, just little clips, very, very quickly, from trip reports from various sources. There's often this talk of high alien technology, this fractal machine-like entities that are extremely complex. Insect-like intelligences are also very, very, very common. This hyper-technological space, very intelligent. And so what's actually going on then? What's actually going on? Well, let's go back to our world-space landscape. Remember this landscape with these hills and these valleys. All possible worlds are represented on this world-space landscape. In the normal waking state, this small region, the consensus reality space, that's a low energy. It's a basin of attraction. This is where the brain moves towards. It can't reach these other areas, this DMT space. However, when you administer DMT, two things happen, two broad phases. There's this initial phase of great, feels like at least, disorder, chaos, chaotic, wild imagery. The world space landscape is being restructured. It is changing its shape. Your brain is shifting rapidly, falling into entirely new regions of the world space landscape. So you get this progression from order to disorder. But then, assuming the dosage is sufficient, something happens. The world space landscape collapses into an entirely new geometry. A geometry in which this other region of the world space landscape becomes this attractor basin. So the cortex naturally falls into this region of the world space landscape. From your perspective, what happens? You break through into this bizarre world that we refer to as the DMT space or hyperspace. So this is exactly what we're seeing happening here. In the normal waking state, the brain can't reach this DMT space. It can't do this. But in the presence of DMT, first there's a flattening and restructuring, and then the world space landscape collapses into the new geometry, and the cortex naturally falls into this new area of the world space landscape. This is the DMT space. So, hopefully, I have convinced you that this world space is something that we should explore. The brain is not just a world-building machine, or not just a machine for building the old familiar consensus world, but is actually a tool. It's a tool that we can learn to tune. We can learn to use it as a technology for exploring these different regions of the world space. The DMT space is just the beginning. The DMT space, although itself vast and inordinately complex, is itself just a region within this vast, practically endless terrain of the world-space landscape. We might say worlds without end. Worlds without end. Children at play in the endless fields of the mind. This is what we are. So, the problem, of course, with DMT, as I also spoke about yesterday, is that it lasts about maybe 10, 15 minutes in total. The first minute or so is this restructuring of the world-space landscape. It's chaotic, this roller coaster phase. Then you break through. This is when the world-space landscape settles into the new geometry. You're in this new world. But just as you're beginning to orient yourself, just as you are beginning to get your intellective tools in order, just as you are beginning to establish communication with the strange beings within the space, you are dragged back out into the normal waking world. The world-space landscape collapses back as DMT leaves the brain, is rapidly metabolized. Your world-space landscape collapses back into its original geometry, and you fall out. You're dragged out of the DMT space. So again, as I was talking about yesterday, with Rick Strassman, we developed a technology, or at least proposed a technology for extending the DMT state. Thank you, Paul, very kind. For extending the experience, for maintaining a stable brain DMT concentration such that you can keep the world-space landscape in that geometry for as long as you want. Now, it's been tried now, very recently, over the last month or so. I won't talk too much, by the Imperial College London team, who were able to achieve stabilization of the DMT state, stabilization of this world-space landscape, restructuring for up to 30 minutes. A team in Basel, this is brand new. Just last week, or in the last couple of weeks, this came out. Extended it for 90 minutes before they ended the infusion, bringing them rapidly out of the DMT space again. So I'll talk a little bit more about than I did yesterday, just about the kind of the technology here, what went into this model. It's not as simple as hooking somebody up to an infusion pump and kind of letting it rip. There's a lot of thought and modeling that goes behind this. So whenever a drug goes into your body, it enters your bloodstream. We call this the central compartment, into your veins. It can then be sometimes immediately or very quickly removed, eliminated, metabolized, excreted through the kidneys, for example. It can also find its way into fats or muscle tissue or other small tissue, small blood vessels. So we have these other compartments that DMT is moving in and out of all the time. But of course, really we're interested in its concentration here, what we call the effect compartment. In simple terms, this is the brain. So it's complicated, in other words. The drug goes in to the central compartment, but have all these different things, all these different processes, all at different rates happening all the time. And to maintain a stable brain DMT concentration, something like this is the ideal case, right? Where the level of DMT in the brain rises and then stabilizes, keeping you in the DMT space. That's difficult to achieve. You have to understand the rates of all these different things. So this requires mathematical modeling. You need to construct what's called a pharmacokinetic model, which in simple terms is simply a model of the rates at which DMT is moving through the body, is being metabolized, is being excreted, etc. And using this model, you can then create you can then program the rates of the infusion in order to keep the concentration here quite constant. So it's a little bit difficult to achieve. So this is not as simple as it sounds, or perhaps it doesn't sound that simple, I'm not sure. But anyway, so breaking down the extended state DMT trip, we have this initial, what I call this roller coaster phase, this entry into the DMT space. You can actually see two lines here. You can see the solid line. You can see this dotted line, or this dashed line. This is actually the blood concentration. You can see it shoots up and then comes back down. This here is the brain concentration, the solid line. So they're different. So you can't just measure the concentration in the blood. This is why you need modeling to know the concentration in the brain. So you have this initial, what's called a bolus injection of the DMT. You give them quite a high dose at once, within about 30 seconds. And then, about a minute later, you begin this infusion. So as the blood concentration starts to drop dramatically, you then begin the infusion, which kind of compensates for the removal of DMT from the body. So you have this balance. You reach this equilibrium where the DMT level in the brain becomes reasonably constant. So this brings us into this orientation phase. This is where, as I said before, the individual orients himself within the DMT space. The DMT space starts to stabilize. That world space landscape that has just undergone this dramatic restructuring starts to settle. And the brain gets used to, the brain settles into constructing these very, very different worlds. And we enter the stabilization phase. This is where you remain. Now, of course, with a normal DMT trip, you never reach these phases. You come out of the roller coaster phase, you maybe have 3 or 4 minutes, really, within the space before the effects start dwindling. You begin to be dragged back out of the DMT space into the normal waking world.
Is that the same with an MAOI?
Yes, with an MAOI, it was just a longer. So it's still the same thing. With an MAOI, you never achieve this. It still goes up and it still goes down, but it's much slower. So with a normal trip, it might look like this. With I don't know why I did the sound for the visually impaired. Yeah, but with an MAI, so with ayahuasca, like that.
What about a DMT inhalation with like Hamala? Like a Hamala?
That also will have a similar kind of effect, but not as dramatic as with ayahuasca. Okay. So what we know so far is that this technology for stabilizing an alternate geometry of your world space landscape. Now there's a phrase you didn't think you were going to hear today, but hopefully you understand what that means now. This is what this DMT technology is. This is why I refer to DMT as a technology. It's not a drug. It's a technology for altering the geometry of your world space landscape, allowing your brain to reach normally inaccessible regions within the landscape. DMTX is a technology for stabilizing this restructuring of your world space landscape. And it works. We proposed it in 2016. We published the paper. It was finally implemented in humans over the last couple of years, and it works. It is tolerable. People don't freak out. Anxiety levels remain low throughout the experience. They don't die yet. Yeah, this might need to be edited. People watch it in the future, but it could be extended. You know, we got up to 90 minutes, but there's no reason why we couldn't extend this for days and weeks. So we can think about this. We start to think about something quite different. This image begins to emerge of us going on extended sojourns, extended expeditions into these other worlds, taking a vacation within the DMT worlds, for example. Why not? Something like this. Now, yesterday I hinted at some of the issues, of course, some of the problems inherent in something like this. Once we get above a day or something, you need to consider the body. The body must be maintained whilst you are journeying, whilst you are on your DMT vacation. The body must be maintained. And so I developed what I call the Matrix Protocol, or the III Protocol, which is a protocol that has not yet been implemented in humans, but I'm planting the seed. A protocol for what you might refer to as semi-permanent transference into this alternate reality space. Semi-permanent transference expeditions into these other worlds. And as I said at the beginning, it has some interesting philosophical implications, because if it's possible to achieve this, then we cannot rule out the possibility that we are indeed on such an expedition right now. So this III protocol, or the Matrix Protocol, has 3 phases, which I will outline: induction, immersion, and integration. And each of them has an early and a late phase. So induction is quite simple. It's the idea of inducing somebody into this alternate reality space. Now, there are a number of ways you can do this. You can just inject someone, hook someone up to this infusion pump, this infusion machine, but often it's quite a traumatic initial experience. Traveling to the DMT worlds can be quite disorienting, it can be quite frightening, it can be quite difficult to stabilize yourself, get your cognitive tools in order once you arrive there. And so I suggest that you might use something like a short-acting infusion of a general anesthetic, which would reduce cortical activity and render you completely unconscious at the beginning. Then what would happen is the anesthetic infusion is gradually released. You gradually remove the infusion as you increase or as you begin the infusion of the DMT. So what then happens is you go to sleep in this world and you wake up. You wake up in the DMT world. There is no traveling required. No roller coaster phase is necessary. So another representation of this induction. So pre-induction, your cortical activity sits at a certain level, you're awake. You then use the anesthetic to bring cortical activity right down. You go to sleep, and then you remove the anesthetic slowly and increase the level of DMT. The DMT actually activates cortical activity a little bit, and this is partly what's responsible for this world-space landscape restructuring. But anyway, so you wake up in the DMT space. Then we have the immersion phase. This is when the individual becomes immersed, fully immersed within the DMT worlds, and may even forget that they were he or she, they or them, were ever human. Anyone who's taken DMT knows that you can sometimes lose not just your identity, if you like, but even the concept of ever being a human. It's a very strange experience. In a sense, your ego and yourself is fully intact, and yet you have no conception, no memory of ever having been a human. You only start to get that back as the drug begins, as the technology, this molecular technology, begins to wear off. So indeed, you might well wake up within this alternate world space, and that will be the world the only world you ever knew. You wouldn't have a memory, perhaps, of ever having been a human when you wake up in the DMT space after the induction phase. Are you scared yet?
I had a situation like that.
Okay, so in the early immersion phase, the subject wakes up. All right. Yay. There we go. Yes. So you are now a member of a citizen with semi-permanent residency visa status. And the cortex fully stabilizes. So what next? What next? Well, this is where things become interesting. Because as you extend this infusion, as your cortex settles into constructing this world model, this alternate world model, things start to change. More permanent restructuring starts to take place. There was an experiment that was done, quite a long time ago now, where a subject, or a number of subjects, were given glasses, spectacles, eyeglasses, I guess you call them over here, that invert the world. They simply invert the visual sensory information. So when you put them on, the world flips upside down. But if you keep them on for a couple of weeks, the world starts to switch back. The brain reorganizes itself. The brain is very plastic. It's called neural plasticity. And the world, as the brain reorganizes itself, because an upside-down world isn't particularly functionally useful, so it reorganizes itself, and the world writes itself again into the correct orientation. The more frightening thing is when you take them off. Because then your world flips again. And that's quite frightening, right? But again, fortunately, the brain is very plastic. Your world gradually orients itself back to its original status. So those eyeglasses aren't that difficult to make. So if anyone wants to try it, then just a thought. So So we can imagine the same kind of thing, or we would expect from a neuroscientific perspective, we would expect a similar kind of thing to start happening over time. Once we get to a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks within the DMT space, we expect this neural remodeling to take place as the brain continues and settles into constructing this alternate world model. So we have this early integration phase, cortical reorganization. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we want to spend the rest of our lives within this alternate reality space. Maybe we don't want to rely on a constant infusion of DMT. Can we reach the stage, the phase, where cortical remodeling will be complete? The brain will no longer naturally revert back to constructing the normal waking world. The world-space landscape will no longer snap back to its original geometry when the DMT is removed, and you would effectively make this permanent. Until, this is important, I don't want to scare you too much here. When I say permanent, I mean as long as you are perhaps receiving information, alternate sensory information from this other reality, your brain will continue to construct a model of that reality, even in the absence of the DMT. Of course, if you wake the individual up, you stimulate their senses in the normal way with sensory information from the environment, eventually you should start to come back. But there are no guarantees here, I'm afraid. So in this late integration phase, the construction of this alternate reality model, this alternate world within a different region of the world-space landscape, is no longer dependent on the presence of the exogenous molecule. You can switch off the machine. So normally this happens, yes, when you remove DMT at the end, it snaps back here to this normal geometry. That's what I was getting at there. But you can avoid that happening by highly extended infusions. So this is really what's happening. It's kind of a summary slide of what's actually going on. This is your set of cortical columns, has these patterns of connections. These patterns of connections going right back to the beginning of the talk. These patterns of connections are important in controlling the states that your cortex reaches. In the normal psychedelic state, you get sort of a democratization, if you like, of cortical activation patterns, this flattening of the landscape. But you don't really get much cortical remodeling. But with DMT, certainly over time, you get a restructuring of this connectivity, a restructuring of the patterns of connections between the cortical columns, such that the brain begins constructing this alternate world by default, even in the absence of the DMT. Now, what's kind of interesting here is that DMT itself promotes this kind of cortical reorganization. That's kind of a little bit uncanny. It's not only switching your reality channel, causing this restructuring of your world space landscape, but is also promoting this cortical remodeling. It's like a two-pronged tool, killing two elves with one 7-dimensional stone. So DMT is this synaptic plasticity promoter. It is helping to form the connections, to reorganize the connections between your cortical columns, whilst also being the primary reality channel switch. There are other types of drugs, don't worry about these, called histone deacetylase inhibitors, or HDACs, which can also be administered And they also promote cortical remodeling. They promote plasticity. So you can inject an individual at intervals with one of these types of drugs to help develop this cortical remodeling process if you wanted to remain within the space on a semi-permanent basis. You can also use precursors of the neuronal membrane. We know that if you administer precursors of the neural membrane, your neurons, of course, are all constructed. They have this membrane, this fatty membrane, as do all cells. And you can promote the production, the reorganization of your cortical network using the precursors to the neuronal membrane. So you're providing the raw materials, if you like, for building new neurons, building new connections. So you could include infusions of these types of molecules together with the DMT. Now, there are other things we need to be concerned about here. Muscle wasting. You want to be functional when you come back, of course, if you decide to come back. Nutrition. You need to be fed. You need to maintain the body, maintain the brain. And, of course, what goes in must come out. Waste. Waste must also be managed. Oxygen, of course, as well. You might just have them breathing the air, but if you have them in some kind of pod, then you will need to think about delivering oxygen. And, of course, removal of carbon dioxide. You might want to manipulate their metabolic rate since they are not moving around whilst they're on this DMT vacation. So their body isn't moving around. You might want to lower their metabolic rate slightly, lower the nutritional and oxygen requirements of the body, perhaps putting them into some kind of low-level state of hibernation. And there are other medical issues that can be imagined would need to be dealt with. In other words, this isn't a simple thing to achieve, but it is achievable. And these kind of things, this slide actually I stole from NASA. I stole this from NASA because NASA have developed protocols for putting, or proposed at least protocols for putting astronauts into a state of kind of low-level hibernation as they are shipped to the furthest reaches of the galaxy, let's say, or Mars. You know, we're talking about expeditions that take several months, and so putting them into this kind of state where they are in a pod, basically, and asleep, unconscious, with all of their bodily requirements taken care of, is perhaps a better way of doing it than having them have to sit on a spaceship twiddling their thumbs for what could be years. So again, we're repurposing technologies used for other purposes. Nutrition. So again, I mentioned this yesterday. You can feed somebody. You don't need to give them food and water as such in the normal oral route. You can deliver. We have the technologies. This is routinely used in clinics to feed someone. Total parenteral nutrition, TPN, where the required nutrition is delivered directly into the bloodstream. Oxygen. You also don't need to give someone air, breathable oxygen anymore. You can actually use this microfluidic device for delivering oxygen directly into your bloodstream. So you get an injection of oxygen. An injection of oxygen. And indeed, some kind of, obviously we wouldn't want a complete hibernation state because the individual must remain conscious, of course. But there might be techniques for lowering the metabolic requirements of the body whilst they were in this state. So we have a kind of a system developed now. The initial induction, the immersion and the integration promoted by these plasticity, synaptic plasticity, and synaptogenesis promoting molecules and drugs. And we also have considered means by which we can maintain the body. So the pod might look something like this, schematically. Forget about the Mg there. This is for the magnetoreceptor. So that's a post-molecular idea which I spoke about yesterday, but I won't talk about today. But we can deal with all of these bodily requirements. We can use, there are techniques now for lowering body temperature through the nose, amazingly. Nasal cooling. Neuromuscular stimulation of key muscle groups in order to maintain the integrity of your musculature. Nutrition, again, IV infusion of nutrition. Oxygen, direct delivery of oxygen into your bloodstream. Waste, obviously urine and fecal waste can be collected, but over time the requirement for that dwindles itself. And some kind of dry immersion, or it could even be wet immersion. So it could even be immersion in some kind of gel. So these images, that image that I showed at the start, this matrix image, the image from the movie The Matrix, might actually be not so far from what this system might look like. And this immersion would aid in complete loss of awareness of your body and sensory stimulation, tactile stimulation of your body, such that you can, your consciousness effectively becomes completely independent of your body. You lose any requirement there. So this is what it might look like. You would lie down in this pod at the beginning of your desired expedition, your desired vacation. You would input some kind of journey time. It might just be a couple of weeks, but it could be many years if you wanted to. You would be put to sleep using the anesthetic. The DMT infusion would begin soon thereafter, and you would wake up in this space. All of your bodily needs and requirements would be taken care of. You might not even remember ever having been a human. That would be your reality. That would be your world. That would be your life. Until the clock ticks down, the clock counts down, and the system shuts off, and the process of reintegration begins. Reintegration back into the normal waking world begins, and that might be an extensive and extended and quite involved process. You would begin the process of returning to the normal waking world and learning to be human again. Because that's really what you'd have to do. And again, at the beginning I mentioned the philosophical implication of that, the idea that this is possible. It is possible to achieve this. It's not straightforward. It's not easy, but we have the technology to achieve this. And so it really does raise the question of our reality right now, and whether or not we are indeed trapped, embedded within some lower dimensional construct, some region of the world space landscape that we have either chosen to visit or perhaps against our will. And there might be a period when you wake up one morning, not in your bed, but in a pod, in some other alternate, what appears to you to be an alternate reality space, and the beings will be gathered around your pod, and they will say, "Welcome home." Thank you very much.
Andrew?
Yes?
So you, after the initial phase, you wait, you're conscious. Yes?
Yes.
So do you still have the requirement of sleep? Would you be sleeping in the DMT world?
That's a really good question. We don't know the answer to that question. It's a really good question. We don't really... My guess is, yes, there would be some kind of sleep requirement. Sleep is necessary. So what would that feel like? What would sleep be like? What would a dream be like? You would be having DMT world dreams. You might even be having dreams of when you were human. Paul?
So early on, you had a slide that showed, I think, the world flattening sort of landscapes,
Yeah.
which talked about ever-present other realities. So it was earlier on than that, where you showed psilocybin on there. Asking for a friend, it feels like psilocybin and acid and other ones don't always produce a feeling of that same world always existing there. So I was curious about psilocybin because with DMT, that seems to me to be, from my friend's point of view, a qualitatively different aspect of the phenomenon.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, with psilocybin, as I said, it's a variant. I kind of tried to show it here, and because you seem to be moving just slightly out of this region. So the states aren't completely different. They are variations on the normal waking world, slightly different permutations, if you like. But yeah, it's still an interesting question. With DMT, of course, you move into an entirely different region. But what's interesting, which I think your question is getting at, is why is there that feeling that the DMT space has always been there, right?
The same intelligence.
The same intelligence. And again, I'll talk more about this in the intensive tomorrow, but it does suggest to me that, so if we look at, here we go. So the consensus reality space is mapped to sensory information. So part of the reason the brain resides within this region of the world space landscape is because it's receiving information from the environment. Yeah, so it's mapped in some way, sensory information. It suggests to me, a couple of things really. It suggests to me that the reason in the presence of DMT the brain remains within this district is because it is also being modulated by sensory information from this DMT space. Now, the reason that it feels, and that would explain why you're seeing the same type of intelligences, because you are literally, although this is still a model built by the brain, you are literally receiving sensory information from some other domain. We don't know where that is, right? Other, I refer to it. Now, there's another interesting feature which I spoke about, which was the sense of familiarity, the sense that we've already been there in some time. And it might suggest that at some point, some people suggest perhaps in the womb, there was some kind of restructuring, either DMT being released in the womb, and we see that in rats, for example. We see high DMT levels that peak shortly after birth and then drop just a few days after birth. We don't know if that's the case in human fetus, in the human fetus, but it could be, and it could be that we have indeed been there before. We don't remember it, or in fact, the most likely explanation is that it's far more complicated than that. We just don't know. There's some relationship between us and this space that we're just unaware of.
The ultimate deja vu.
The ultimate deja vu. It really is, yes.
It's true.
Yeah.
The familiarity you talk about, it's true because, on a DMT journey myself, I woke up on a table playing cards with these beings, and they were like, "Oh, you're back, all right." And there was a smoking device right there. and I grabbed it, and they said, are you gonna go back again? And I just hit it, and here I was here. So, it's that whole...
Yeah. Which is, it's like Lao Tzu when he dreamt he was a butterfly, or is he a butterfly now dreaming that he's a human? You know what I mean?
Right.
It's that kind of thing. And a number of people have had that kind of experience where they take a hit of DMT and they wake up, sometimes in these pods that I'm talking about. With lots of pods around them, with aliens saying, "Oh, we brought you back for maintenance." Yeah, pretty horrifying, right? And then they send him back, and he comes out of the DMT state. So it's like I'm really genuinely not sure that we're not actually, my true body, if I can say such a thing, isn't suspended in some gel somewhere, and that I decided to have a long vacation for several decades. Yeah? Okay, I don't have a... Okay, I'm going to go to you, sir.
This, where we go to, or where you go to, is a real place, right? These are real things and real people. Okay, so...
We think so, yes. Some would disagree, but yes.
Consistency, and you can compare one experiencer to another experiencer.
Yeah,
So I'm wanting to accept that.
good.
So now...
Saves an argument.
Well, I'm not arguing with you.
I know.
So when you smoke it, you have this spike and this reorganization and the scramble in the brain and all, God knows what's going on there. And it eventually settles, but then it falls out. So
Yeah.
when you absorb that spike with anesthetics, is there a danger there where some of these creatures are there waiting for that and they're gonna, like little, we have these machine elves and these great things and the insectoids who are intelligent, but over here are these things waiting to get you during the anesthetic phase. What are you exposed to?
I see what you mean, yeah. I mean, there's no evidence, I mean, really, that... I mean, people, as I said, a number of people have done this extended state DMT work, and there's no indication of true... but I understand... But there is certainly, I mean, these things are not risk-free. I mean, I don't think anyone would walk away thinking that what I'm suggesting is risk-free. It's just kind of an idea, right? There's a way of thinking. But yeah, you can imagine, perhaps, I mean, if you are dealing with some kind of truly advanced autonomous intelligence, then there's always the possibility that they might take advantage of you when you are in a vulnerable state, shall we say. Yeah.
If the cortical columns are damaged, would that explain why certain people can't perceive motions?
Precisely, yeah. So yesterday I spoke about this damaging certain parts of the brain. Because different cortical columns are specialized to represent different types of information, different features of the world, movement and color, etc., and shapes. If you have this rare condition, normally caused by a very focal small stroke in a very particular area of the brain, it is damaging, yes. It's damaging those cortical columns that represent movement information. And this is why these individuals with this rare condition and one almost unimaginable condition called achinotopsia see the world as a series of still images. So you got it. Not achinotopsia, but you got the message. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, this may be off topic, but Dr. Stanislav Grof insists that 5-MeO DMT will put him into the state of Dharmakaya, which is a Tibetan Buddhist anti-yoga dimension. Do you know of anyone who has made a comparative study of your high-tech route or technology to get to this quote Dharmakaya state versus the quote low-tech applications of the meditative states and the various postures and so on that we do in the yoga?
Not formal studies. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal reports of people claiming to, and I don't want to discredit them or say that it's not true, claiming to reach these kind of states using alternate methods. And you can imagine there are other techniques for causing this restructuring, this landscape restructuring in the brain. Now, the 5-MeO space, of course, that occupies a region within the world space. So this is the DMT space, if you like, this set of states within the world space that represent the DMT worlds. This formless, infinitely expansive, white light kind of world that you experience on the influence of 5-MeO DMT. This is another region of the world space landscape. So it's causing a different restructuring of the world. Yeah, 5-MeO. Five.
It's a different potion.
Yes, a different molecule.
Different molecule and a different impact.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah.
Just like meditation would be another.
It could well be, yes, but it's my contention that these molecules are much quicker and easier, much more reliable.
You don't have to sit in a cave.
You don't sit in a cave for 20 years. Yeah. Yes.
Can you do something similar with microdosing?
With microdosing, similar to...
I mean, maybe not exactly.
LSD.
Something for the experience?
For...
Restructuring?
Well, with microdosing, yeah, you are getting... I mean, assuming it actually... I mean, certainly with psilocybin, let's say... Yeah, I mean, whether it microdosing, it's a little bit debatable. But certainly, yes, with psilocybin, you are causing. I mean, psilocybin is a plasticity promoter, just like DMT. It promotes this cortical remodeling. And so when you take psilocybin, I mean, one of the ways we think that psychedelic therapy works is it causes this flattening of the cortical landscape, yes, this world space landscape, allows the brain to reach new states more easily. So if you're depressed and your brain has kind of restructured itself to reach highly negative states where you're questioning your will to live or you're questioning the value of your life, this kind of thing. This is kind of a depressive state, and it's hard to get out of because you need to restructure. You need to remodel the cortex. When psilocybin goes in there, it flattens out the cortical, this world space landscape, allows the brain to shift to new states. And then, actually, you get some cortical remodeling that takes place. And so the brain settles into a more positive state. It's like heating up, as I said, like heating up a piece of glass. So you can twist it and move it into any shape that you like. And then as it cools, it settles into that new shape. So it's the same idea, yes. Yes.
I recently took a psilocybin trip. I think it was 3.5 grams. And,
Nice.
Part of the trip involved me opening my eyes, and everything was pixels. Everything was pixels. And then I would look at what I knew somewhere was a painting, and slowly it would turn into a different painting, but then slowly it turned into the painting I recognized. What was happening?
Well, let's think about it. I'm going to do the professor answer and offer questions as the answer. So what is happening there? Well, anyone like to explain? What's happening there? Well, the world is changing, right? The world becomes more dynamic. Why? Yeah, exactly, right? So normally when there's these deep valleys, the brain moves through these valleys, and it's quite rigid, it's quite predictable. Once you flatten that out, the cortex can actually move, not just move to more states, but actually move between states much more easily. So that's what's happening there. Your world is literally changing. Your brain, these patterns of cortical column activation are shifting much more rapidly over time. And so this is why your world becomes more fluid and more dynamic, and that's what you're experiencing. Absolutely, yes, but it is a flattening, as I said, of this world space landscape. So your brain is reaching more regions that are slightly outside of the normal state that it wouldn't normally reach in the absence of psilocybin. But you're right, it doesn't move past that phase, which you get with high-dose DMT, where the landscape actually collapses into a different geometry and the cortex moves to a different region.
Do you feel that I'm a psychologist and we're starting a psilocybin psychotherapy center?
Very nice.
Do you feel, I mean, I've been coming on I've been using the research of Carhart Harris and, the universities here, Johns Hopkins, et cetera.
Yep.
Do you feel that in healing a person of depression
Yes, and it is being incorporated into that. The problem again was that because DMT is so fast, it's hard to do work, whilst you're in the DMT space. It's kind of, you're in there, it's this roller coaster, it's all wild, and then you kind of are out again. So this part of the reason that we actually proposed this DMTX technology, me and Rick Strassman, and we wrote in the original paper, this isn't just necessarily about exploring worlds, alternate realities, but could also be an invaluable tool for psychotherapy. You can push someone into the DMT state, do the work, so to speak, whatever the therapist does, and then perhaps pull them out a little bit, and then push them again.
These robots or whoever's in the DMT world, they would participate in helping this person get well?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, but that does happen. And somebody actually spoke to me before this workshop. Somebody who was recovering from addiction and went into the DMT space with that intent. Help me, and you can actually experience. You can feel them. You can see them. They scan your body with strange machinery. They go in. You can feel them reorganizing, like they're rewiring your brain. So yeah, I mean that's kind of remarkable. This idea that it's not just you healing yourself in a sense, but you might actually be recruiting advanced intelligences to heal you. To work out, what's the problem, and to fix the problem in much more efficiently than any human doctor could ever hope to. Sorry to say.
Can it be an enhancing experience where, like with Tori, the superhuman concept, can we go places that we can't go by ourselves? Can they make us into?
Well, one would imagine it's. The thing is, we're just dipping our toes into the water, really, in a way with DMT. We haven't really established two-way, stable communication or kind of a relationship. Some people have within, but we could imagine these sort of things. I mean, there's an infinite number of things that might be possible once we establish a relationship with an intelligence of immense proportions. I mean, what would you do with that? What would you do with that ability? The ability to reliably communicate and receive information from an intelligence that was orders of magnitude higher than us. How do you get started on this journey? Okay, that's a good question. I mean, I can't kind of give sources, so to speak. I can't offer any. But, yeah, so, I mean, people do. I mean, first of all, it's illegal in the United States. It's a Schedule I substance. I should say that, first of all, for right or wrong, right? But DMT is very easy, actually, to extract from natural sources. So there's two major natural sources of DMT that 95% of people who do DMT use. One is Mimosa hostilis, the root bark, dried root bark, which you can buy. It's also a dye, so it's like a purple dye. So you can buy it as a dye. And the other is called Acacia confusa. There is actually the highest concentration of DMT in the world is where? Naturally occurring DMT in the world is where? Taiwan, yes. Taiwan is drenched in DMT. It contains the highest concentration. Well, that's kind of, I think that's the case. It has the highest concentration of Acacia confusa in the world, and Acacia confusa has some of the highest concentrations of DMT of any plant source. So go to Taiwan if you want. It's a beautiful country as well, and it is drenched in DMT, Taiwan. But you can buy these root barks online. You can extract them in your kitchen with relative ease. There's hundreds of instruction guides on the internet. There are YouTube videos on how to do this. That's true, yes. But there are good websites, like the DMT Nexus is an excellent site, where you can find lots of information, what are referred to as techs, T-E-K. So there are lots of different techs the different processes that you can follow, like following a recipe to produce DMT. And you can do it in a few hours in your kitchen with Mimosa hostilis root bark, certainly.
Without the emetic effects?
Exactly. No worries. Yes.
In Sanskrit, there is a natural state of being called steadiness, steady like a mountain. In Sanskrit, it's stitna prana, and that means the absence of thought. So do you have data for absence of thought? And if you do, does that correlate to that straight line as opposed to peaks and valleys?
I don't have data on that, no. So that's the first time anyone's, I've heard that Sanskrit term, so.
It's Vedas, the Vedas have a lot of this, the Maya physics is all in Advaita Vedanta.
Ah, cool. Okay, yeah, it's something I need to research, but no, I can't offer anything.
For 10,000 plus years.
Well, maybe so, yes. It certainly has a long history in humans, probably longer than we imagine, yeah. How long do we have left?
1 minute.
Okay, so final question, gentleman in the blue.
Usually, there is some kind of physiological benefit evolutionarily to receptor sites or the functionality of the body.
Mm-hmm.
What might you hypothesize would be the evolutionary advantage of the human body to have receptor sites for this particular substance?
Okay, so the receptor site, again, I'll talk about this in the intensive tomorrow in more detail. The receptor site is actually a receptor site for serotonin. So serotonin is, of course, one of the brain's most important neuromodulator or neurotransmitter. It's a type of neurotransmitter. And so the DMT is actually binding to a particular type of these. There are about 16 types of these serotonin receptors in the brain, all bind to serotonin, of course, and that modulates neural activity. And DMT is actually binding to one particular type of these serotonin receptors. So there's very good evolutionary reason why these receptors would be there. Perhaps a related question is, what's the evolutionary reason, or why should the brain have evolved to be able to construct these alternate realities with such efficiency? That is a really interesting question. And that's why I do take this reality somewhat seriously, very seriously, because there doesn't seem to be a simple explanation for why the brain should be able to begin constructing with great efficiency these highly complex alternate worlds that bear no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. I don't think anyone's explained that satisfactorily within the kind of standard paradigm of modern neuroscience. Okay, I think we have to end, but thank you very much.